Hey everybody, Pastor Kevin here, bringing you this week group curriculum guidance. We're going to be on the question starting on page 13. This is session number 2 of this volume 2, part 1 of our Acts series. Keep in mind, we're going to be in Acts for a bit of time. So let's just jump straight in. Question number 1. What do you think the phrase full of grace and power is intended to communicate? Now, you can go and kind of just go through everyone's discussion points on this. I'm not really seeking a particular answer, but you may recall that Jesus was called full of grace and truth. So there's something there that you could probably pull on. There's also the idea of power, which clearly there's an empowerment from the Spirit that has been very, very purposeful and a huge element of kind of the theme of the book of Acts. But talk about that. How is it that grace and power go together? When you think of grace, there's a few things, and we don't want to go too far down a path of like our cultural understanding, but grace kind of has 2 ways you could think about it. There's the grace that's been received and the grace that is given, and maybe you should talk about it in that sense as well. Question number 2. Who has been doing signs and wonders to this point in Acts? Give examples. Who was doing these signs and wonders before Acts? What is Luke telling us about delegated authority? Does it mean everyone can do the same? Do we see the same from Acts 6:5? The answer to the last question is clearly there's no. It's not necessarily saying that everyone is doing the exact same thing, right? You have the 7 that are set aside to do these particular jobs. And you can see now one of the 7 here in Stephen, who's actually empowered to do the very same thing that the apostles were doing, who were doing the very same thing that Jesus was doing in his ministry. So you see that there's this empowerment of the Spirit that is carried on through the mission. In essence, the mission that Jesus begins as the Son of God. Now, granted, we're not the Son of God in that sense, right? We are not fully God, fully man, but we have his very presence with us. We have been empowered by the Spirit of the living God. And in doing so, it gives us the ability to do things that maybe we weren't expecting ourselves even to do. And in this case, you have Stephen who's doing those same things as the actual apostles. They've been commissioned to do a particular job. And it seems like this is right after the commissioning of them to deal with the taking care of the widows, making sure that the equal portions are given out to the Hebrews and the Hellenists. And now immediately you have this picture of Stephen, who was commissioned to do that work, doing the work of proclamation, right? In a sense, the whole idea of ministry of the word is happening through Stephen now. Okay, so I think there's something clearly telling about that. And then maybe you could even start to extend this further to our own lives. And we'll get a little bit further into that as we go through this session. Question number 3. Where were the people of this synagogue from? Are these locals? What do you think Friedman might indicate? When I ask this question, I think it may be a little bit sending you potentially in the wrong direction. It's not that they're not locals, but the point is this synagogue of Friedman was likely probably made up of a bunch of those Hellenist people we were talking about last week. We talked about who Hellenists were, right? They were those that were Jewish religiously, but maybe had been gone out. Maybe they've come from the diaspora. Maybe they have come from different countries. They may speak different languages, but in all likelihood, Greek was their main language of maybe the scriptures they read and so forth. And again, some of this is conjecture, but there is an understanding that this idea of freedmen is something that is in the greater Roman world. It's when you are basically people who were in slavery within the Roman world. When you get freed, you can either be work your way out, be bought out, and so forth. There's all kinds of different ways. It's different than the slavery we might think of. Not necessarily that it's not as bad. I mean, it's more of there were a lot of people in slavery in the ancient world, in ancient Rome, a ton of them. And many of them did get out. So this name of this synagogue is the Freedmen Synagogue. And the thought is, okay, well, it's very possible that a lot of these people were what? They're probably Hellenists. They're probably those who have come back into Judaism, Jerusalem, and now they live there, or maybe they're there for something else, and this is the place where they feel the most comfortable. Okay, so you've gone from the commissioning of the 7, where you have this problem between Hebrew and Hellenist, and now you have one of the men picked who's likely a Hellenist, Stephen, who is actually now in this synagogue speaking irrefutably with those likely, again, I don't want to say this too strongly, likely Hellenist Jews in that synagogue. Question number 4. Have you ever presented an argument so well that people were angry with you? Or maybe you were the angry one. Explain the situation. This is just one of those ways to kind of step a little bit out of the scripture and see what's happening. So Stephen has made irrefutable arguments. Have you ever had someone make an irrefutable argument to you? I have. It's one of those things where like the argument's so strong, and usually there's a couple ways, there's a spectrum of how you can respond, right? On one side is, okay, you're right. On the other side is, my haughty pompousness would say, no way, and I'd come up with all these other reasons. And sometimes we go ad hominem, which means against the other person. You sort of say mean things about them. You see how this spectrum exists, and you have probably played yourself on this spectrum, right? In our culture, oftentimes, not many people just humbly say, oh, you know what? You're right. That doesn't happen very often. So I want you to talk about maybe a specific situation that you have in your life as a facilitator and leader of this group, and maybe that there's some others where you just know that there are times where it just, to use an idiom, it chaps your hide when someone is right, and you respond in a way. So I guess part of me is wanting you to see how the way that this response is happening is one that's very human. It's not great because it's a response to truth with untruth, but ultimately, I want us to be able to say, yeah, I get that, because I've seen that kind of wrong thinking and wrong response in my own heart. Okay? Question number 5. Read Exodus 20:16, 23:1-3, and Deuteronomy 19:18-19. How does the law of Moses treat false witnesses? Okay. It's a simple one. You're going to just go read those passages, and it's the Deuteronomy passage that actually gets into kind of some of the consequences of bearing false witness. I mean, you have to realize, even in an ancient world, that to have someone come and lie against you could have some very drastic consequences, and that's why it was dealt with so harshly. So I want you to just be picturing this in an Israelite mind, how bearing false witness is to be treated, how it is to be thought of, right? One of the 10 commandments, and how it's being just purely executed here, and think of the rationale of why, right? You have to think on why are they doing it. Now, we don't really know, but you can kind of get to some of those conclusions from what we've been reading so far. Question number 6, who was the last to come before the Jerusalem Council? How did it go? Now, there's a couple layers this we could think back on. The most recent is the apostles came before the council, right? And that's the whole situation where it ends with Gamaliel saying, hey, careful how you get in the way of these people. But they are all whipped. They are all beaten. And that kind of beating is not like your mama smacking your butt. This is a different thing, right? So the response was not good. And if you go back at the just kind of the pre-shadowing of this, you go all the way back to your king. You go to the Christ, and how was he treated when these untruths occurred? And last time someone comes before the council, when you come before the high priest, what happens when you're a Christian? It's really important to recognize that. Question number 7. List all of the charges against Stephen here. It will be important for next week. So this is a pretty easy hunt and peck. You just need to go and find. There's basically 2 particular statements that you may have heard in the sermon. They're kind of aligned pretty well. Keep track of those, because Stephen is going to, this is the accusation. Today we're going through the accusation of Stephen. Stephen is coming against people who are probably like him, Hellenist Jews, and he's making an irrefutable argument about why Jesus is Christ, right? And you don't even really know what those are, but it's saying that no one can compete with him, right? We've seen this happen before, right? So you have that happen, and next week is going to be all about Stephen's response to his accusation, okay? And I think you want to hold these couple things in place. It talks about being, it's basically blasphemy against God, Moses, the law, the temple, right? So find those out, discuss them. It did come up in the sermon as well. Question number 8, find all the comparisons between the accusation of Stephen here and the treatment of Jesus in Mark 14:55-64. Now, the passage in Mark is just going to take you through that part of the story of Jesus where he's getting false accusations made about him. And they're not even sticking. Like, there's not even it's clear that they're having trouble sticking it to him, and they awaited until it finally got to the point where Jesus responds with this. They ask him a question, he answers them honestly. But I want you to see those similarities, because you're going to see this happen. It's already happened a bit with the apostles. Now it's happening with Stephen. And this is a very important message of the book of Acts, is that so goes the king, the Messiah, so go the people who follow him. And Jesus said this. He said that, hey, blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake. Do you remember? Right? So it's important to see some of the very things that are, Luke as an author is saying, hey, do you remember some of these things? Do you remember some of these things coming up previously? And it's important to kind of keep this list going of how is Jesus being likened to the people that are coming after in Luke, or how are the people in Luke being likened to Jesus and what he experienced and what he went through, you see. Question number 9. Why do you think Luke includes the detail that all who gazed at Stephen's face saw that it was like the face of an angel? What would it communicate to look like a divine being? Okay, so there's different ways that people have tried to understand what does it mean that Stephen's face was like an angel, right? But imagine for a second, because I don't think, there are two ways to take the Greek word. When the Greek talks about an angel, it either means a messenger, just a straight up general messenger, or a divine messenger. And I think it's pretty clear in this case, he's just not a messenger, right? They're saying he has the face of an angel. He has the face of a divine. There is something divine about what is being presented before them when they've made the accusation. He hasn't even refuted anything yet. He's simply, I'm sorry, that's not true. They just had kind of their dialogue back and forth, and Stephen is irrefutable. They've made an accusation, and then next week is going to be all about Stephen's full response. But right now, it's say that he had a face of an angel. And at minimum, you have to see that Luke is tipping his hat to this idea of what Stephen is doing is divine work. It's godly work. And if you remember from the sermon today, it was so powerful, at least Isaac and Gilroy is talking about being temple people, being little parts of Eden. And he used the idea of Moses, when Moses comes into contact with Yahweh and comes down to the people, he's glowing. When there is a closeness to the presence of the King of the universe, there is a glowing. There is something about us that looks different. And what does that communicate? What does that communicate to accusers, for example? What does it communicate to accusers who know they're lying? There's all kinds of ways you could start thinking about this. But it's actually a perfect shift into carrying the torch. I just want you to consider your life and how you live. I want you to think about, if we're to be temple people, the place where heaven and earth meet, if we're to be little pieces of Eden walking around so that the rest of the world would know that this is what God intends this to be an Eden place. It's an Edenic, beautiful place where there is no more, the whole idea that there's no more darkness and no more night and no more sea. You'll find that in the book of Revelation. And the idea there isn't there that you can't go to the beach. It's not that there's no moon, or the point is being said is that there's no danger anymore. The sea was a place of chaos. At night, things happened that were dangerous. So you see, the fact that Revelation speaks in that kind of imagery, it's saying that in the new heavens and new earth, there's no more anxiety, there's no more war, there's no more sickness, right? So if that's true, and we are to be walking around as little Eden people, little people who are of the place that has been promised us, how are we dealing with our lives, our sin, our brokenness? The very Spirit of the living God is said to dwell within his temple, said to dwell within his temple people. Does that make you at least think twice about how you live your life? At least. This is what I want you to challenge your people and be very cautious and gracious. But I think about that just reading through this and think about my own life. And I'm like, I want to be so badly a little piece of Eden. But my sin gets in my way. My own desires to do my own will, that gets in the way. There's so many things that get in the way. And I literally lately have been just praying after just going through Acts. I'm like, Lord, fill me. I know that I have his spirit, but it's like, no, fill me so I am overflowing with that spirit, that I would be literally looking like a little piece of Eden, both in grace and in truth, and always, of course, in his power. If I'm doing his will, then I will be gracious and I will be truthful, always in love, always trying to seek the betterment, the flourishing of those around us, to point them to what true flourishing is, which is flourishing is being an image bearer of the King of the universe, the one who created everything, the one who's called us into the same work. So I challenge you. When people look at you, when they gaze at you, do they see the voice, the face of an angel? And I think all of us are going to say no. But this is my challenge to you, is like, well, maybe the goal shouldn't be just the face of an angel, but literally the recognition of, I carry the Spirit of the living God with me. That is the promise of Scripture. That is what Jesus has done through his life, death, and resurrection. I have received a helper, a paraclete, not just any, literally one of the persons of the triune God is with me. Do I live differently? And maybe even a call back to last week. Last week we talked about, hey, are you serving in any of the gifts that you have? Are you even trying to volunteer? Maybe that's one thing. I mean, that's just a simple thing. But what about our sin? Look, I know there are people in your group and they are struggling with their sin. How about we just make a general recognition that we are sinful people, but we're called not to? How can we confess? How can we repent? How can we make changes and rhythms in our lives that would help us go in the right direction? Because it's not about how much we've moved. It's literally, how much are we wanting? How much is our faith driving us to submit everything to Jesus? How much is it just saying, I want to be different than I am right now. I know I have these challenges that I'm carrying with me. Lord, I want to give them over to you. And if that means I have to keep giving them over every day, every hour, whatever, I'm going to do that. You see, so I pray that you would call your group into holiness, into sanctification, not in some like judgy, like, there are ways that this can go bad. Like I'm telling you, don't push them in a negative way, but call them into the glory that's been given. Call them into the wonder and the humility and the grace and the love that it's already been granted. It's one of those things we start to live out of the true identity that we recognize we have. We've been given that through the gospel. Jesus has done his work so that we could be engaged in creation like we were intended to be. Humanity was intended to be from the beginning. So I just pray this week would be great. I pray that your challenge would be full of grace and truth and hope. And for you as well, because I know, I'm a pastor here, I struggle with stuff, and I'm sure you do as well. So I am calling you into the wonders of God's goodness so that you can walk around like an even more beautiful little part of Eden. That's it. God's beauty somehow just comes in. We are cleansed by his Spirit. We look more beautiful. We are more true. We are more good than we could ever be on our own. And it looks different. So I pray that you would help your group just live into that this week. We'll see you next time.